February 1944 marked a moment when a long struggle for control of the European skies entered its decisive phase. The operation that followed would later be known as Operation Argument, or more simply, Big Week. It was designed not as a single blow, but as a sustained test of aircraft, pilots, leadership, and industrial endurance. From February 20th to February 25th, American bombers flew deep into Germany day after day, targeting aircraft factories, engine plants, and assembly lines essential to the Luftwaffe's survival. This time, the bombers did not go alone. Thousands of American fighters escorted the formations across the Reich. P-51 Mustangs, joined by P-47s now operating with extended range, moved ahead of the bomber streams. They swept the skies, attacking German fighters as they climbed and regrouped. The air battle stretched across hundreds of miles, from the German border to the heart of industrial cities. For German pilots, the scale of the confrontation was overwhelming. Interceptions that once involved manageable numbers now escalated into continuous engagements. Fighters were forced into repeated sorties with little time for rest or repair. Fuel shortages became critical. Aircraft that survived one engagement were often lost in the next. The Luftwaffe responded with determination, but diminishing resources. Veteran pilots were sent up repeatedly, their experience essential but irreplaceable. Losses mounted rapidly. Aircraft factories, already under pressure, struggled to replace destroyed machines while also repairing damage from bombing raids. American commanders watched the results closely. Losses among bombers and fighters were significant, but the balance was shifting. For the first time, German fighter strength declined faster than it could be replenished. Escort fighters were no longer merely defending bombers. They were dismantling the Luftwaffe itself. Reports from German units reflected a growing sense of crisis. Pilots described American fighters appearing everywhere at all altitudes. The traditional advantages of home territory, short flight times, ground control, familiar airfields, no longer guaranteed survival. The psychological impact was profound. German pilots realized that even successful interceptions now carried unacceptable risk. Every engagement depleted strength without meaningful strategic gain. The skies over Germany had become a battlefield Germany could not control, yet the decisive change was still unfolding. Big Week did not destroy the Luftwaffe outright. What it did was force Germany into a war of attrition it could not win. As February turned toward spring, the question was no longer whether American fighters could reach deep into the Reich, but whether Germany had the strength left to stop them at all. As the air battles of February 1944 subsided, the consequences of Big Week became impossible to conceal. The Luftwaffe still existed. German aircraft still took the skies. But something essential had been lost: its ability to recover. In the weeks that followed, American escort fighters continued their deep penetration missions with growing confidence. What had been a concentrated offensive became routine. Bombers crossed into Germany almost daily, and their escorts stayed with them from departure to return. The skies that once offered moments of relative safety now delivered only sustained pressure. German pilot losses during this period carried a weight that numbers alone could not convey. The Luftwaffe's greatest strength had never been sheer quantity, but experience. Many of its most capable pilots had accumulated hundreds of combat hours earlier in the war. By early 1944, those veterans were gone or grounded. Their replacements arrived with sharply reduced training time, sometimes less than half the hours their predecessors had logged. American fighters exploited this imbalance mercilessly, though methodically. Escort pilots were instructed to engage enemy aircraft wherever found, not only near bomber formations, but during climb, retreat, and landing. Air superiority was no longer confined to specific battles. It became a condition of the sky itself. This shift marked a critical doctrinal victory. American escorts stopped thinking in terms of protection alone. They began shaping the airspace. German pilots were forced to react continuously, burning fuel, wearing engines, and making decisions under constant threat. Every sortie drained resources Germany could not afford to lose. By spring 1944, Luftwaffe commanders faced impossible choices: defend factories and lose pilots, conserve pilots and lose industry. There was no longer a third option. Escort fighters had erased it. The impact reached beyond Germany's borders. With air superiority increasingly secure, Allied planners accelerated preparations for a cross-channel invasion. The skies over France and the Low Countries grew steadily quieter, not because the Luftwaffe was absent, but because it was weakened beyond effective resistance. For German pilots, the realization came slowly, then all at once. The Reich was no longer defended by distant skill or technology. American fighters had matched and surpassed each advantage. They could fly farther, they could stay longer, and most critically, they returned again and again. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy in June 1944, the outcome in the air was no longer in doubt. German fighters rose to meet the invasion, but they did so without the strength, coordination, or numbers they once possessed. The decisive struggle had already been fought, high above the Reich months earlier. With the skies effectively secured, the consequences of deep escort penetration now unfold on the ground, reshaping the course of the war. The immediate consequences of the deep escort operations over Germany were both tactical and strategic. German industry had endured repeated attacks during Big Week, but now the scale and efficiency of bombing became truly devastating. Fighter factories, engine plants, and assembly lines, the very backbone of Luftwaffe capability, were now exposed without the hope of protection. Even when German pilots managed to intercept bombers, the continuous presence of escorts meant that losses were rarely decisive. For the Luftwaffe, the cost was cumulative. Experienced pilots, lost in combat over industrial regions, could not be replaced quickly. Training programs had been compressed due to earlier war demands, leaving new pilots with minimal experience. Each loss was magnified, not just in material terms, but in the erosion of tactical knowledge and unit cohesion. German fighter groups increasingly relied on young, green pilots who could not match the skill of their predecessors. Attrition was no longer linear, it was exponential. American forces, by contrast, could sustain their operations with unprecedented industrial and logistical support. Lost bombers and fighters were replaced rapidly. Production lines in the United States operated at a scale Germany could never match. The 8th Air Force was able to plan successive operations with confidence, knowing that its pilots, aircraft, and supplies could endure losses that would have previously been catastrophic. Civilians on the ground began to notice a shift as well. Cities that had once been spared the brunt of the Allied bombing campaign now experienced sustained raids. Factories slowed, transportation networks faltered, and the psychological impact of repeated air attacks became evident. For German society, the war in the skies was no longer distant. It was immediate. Reports from German command reflected frustration and disbelief. The Luftwaffe's radar networks, anti-aircraft artillery, and fighter bases, previously relied upon to defend the Reich, were increasingly ineffective. American escorts intercepted German fighters before they could coordinate attacks, reducing both the effectiveness and morale of defending units. Statements from surviving German pilots later emphasized their astonishment at the range and persistence of the P-51 Mustang, describing it as a constant, unrelenting threat. At the operational level, the implications were clear. Air superiority over Germany was no longer an assumption. It was actively contested and steadily lost. German planners could no longer allocate resources purely to defense. The need to conserve pilots forced a reactive strategy, ceding initiative to the Allies. The tactical advantage of surprise, which had once protected key industrial sites, was eliminated. Every American bombing raid was now supported by a force capable of engaging German fighters continuously, effectively neutralizing their ability to mount sustained resistance. As this attrition continued, the stage was set for Allied planners to exploit air superiority fully, directly influencing the success of upcoming ground operations and the broader strategy for liberating Western Europe. By mid-1944, the long-term consequences of American escort penetration were undeniable. German fighter strength was declining at a pace that no amount of industrial output or pilot training could offset. The Luftwaffe had suffered a catastrophic erosion of its experienced corps, leaving its most critical units undermanned and undertrained. Veteran pilots who had once dominated the skies over Europe were either lost in combat, grounded by fatigue, or transferred to secondary fronts. Replacement crews, though numerous, lacked the skill and tactical knowledge to challenge American formations effectively. The strategic picture had changed dramatically. The Allies could now operate with near-continuous dominance in the air, particularly over northern and central Germany. Bombing campaigns that had previously been constrained by fear of unescorted vulnerability could now be executed with greater precision and consistency. Factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs were systematically targeted, reducing Germany's capacity to sustain its war machine. Post-war German assessments, including Luftwaffe after-action reports and memoirs, highlighted the profound impact of escort fighters. Pilots frequently remarked on the disorienting effect of American fighters that accompanied bombers all the way to deep targets, a practice that had been considered impossible just months earlier. Even highly skilled Luftwaffe units could not adapt to the relentless presence of these long-range aircraft, describing engagements as constant, overwhelming, and unavoidable. American command, meanwhile, took stock of the operation's broader lessons. The success of deep escort penetration validated years of doctrinal adjustment and technological innovation. Long-range fighters were no longer auxiliary support. They were the backbone of strategic bombing campaigns. Their ability to both protect and destroy reshaped air combat doctrine and laid the groundwork for future operational planning, including the air component of the Normandy invasion and the sustained bombing campaigns leading to Germany's surrender. The psychological effect on German pilots was equally significant. Surviving veterans spoke of a sky that was no longer theirs command, of operations that left little room for error, and of an enemy that seemed to anticipate every movement. This loss of confidence further compounded material and tactical disadvantages, accelerating the Luftwaffe's decline. Whereas once a pilot might rely on experience and intuition to survive engagements, by 1944, those advantages had been neutralized. In essence, the arrival of American long-range escort fighters marked a turning point in the European air war. It demonstrated that technology, production capacity, and disciplined training could decisively shift the balance in a theater long dominated by skillful but increasingly outnumbered defenders. The operational, strategic, and psychological outcomes of this shift extended beyond the skies, directly enabling Allied ground operations and undermining Germany's ability to resist invasion. With the Luftwaffe's power waning and the Reich exposed, the war above Germany had set the stage for final campaigns that would ultimately decide the fate of Europe.
The story of deep escort fighters over Germany is, in many ways, a story of inevitability meeting preparation. It was not the product of luck or sudden invention, but of years of industrial effort, doctrinal refinement, and strategic foresight. The P-51 Mustang, with its Merlin engine and extended range, was more than a machine. It was the embodiment of American adaptability, combining technology, training, and tactical insight in a single instrument of air power. For German pilots, the shock was profound and enduring. The skies they had once considered under their control became a theater where every decision carried heightened risk. The psychological strain of encountering disciplined, persistent, and lethal escorts reshaped their perception of the war. Disbelief gave way to resignation, and skill alone could no longer guarantee survival. Experience, the Luftwaffe's historical advantage, was gradually eroded by attrition and relentless pressure. From a broader historical perspective, this shift highlights a central lesson of modern warfare. Control of the sky is decisive. Air superiority did not merely protect ground forces or bombing missions, it determined strategic initiative. By enabling bombers to reach their targets with minimal disruption, escort fighters ensured that industrial centers, transportation hubs, and military infrastructure were systematically weakened, directly influencing the pace and success of the Allied advance into Europe. Yet the story also carries a human dimension. Behind the technical achievements were thousands of pilots, American and German, whose endurance, courage, and skill defined each engagement. The calm, calculated professionalism of American crews contrasted with the increasingly desperate improvisation of German pilots, producing encounters that were as psychological as they were physical. Ultimately, the deep penetration of escort fighters reshaped the air war over Europe, turning a contested sky into a decisive instrument of Allied strategy. It serves as a reminder that warfare is not determined by single technologies or brilliant maneuvers alone, but by the intersection of innovation, discipline, and relentless execution, a lesson written in the clouds over the Reich and remembered in the history of modern air combat. And so, the skies that once belonged to Germany became the proving ground for a new era of air warfare, one defined by reach, persistence, and the inexorable logic of preparation.